Anyway, again, thanks everyone for coming along. As I said, 4 very, very different books. In fact, they couldn't really be more different. Perhaps the only thing they have in common is there's a murder, or there's a body. But just grab my notes. Let's just work quickly through them. Benjamin Stevenson, whose book Everyone on This Train is a Suspect, is telling you everything you didn't want to know about the entrails of publishing and the fragility of writers, apart from anything else, in which we see the return of Ernest Cunningham, an accidental crime writer and now a super sleuth. It's a locked train mystery. Anne Buist's Locked Ward mystery is a murder committed in a postpartum psych ward, and her protagonist, the forensic psychiatrist with low lithium levels and addicted to quetiapine, is that how it's called? Quetiapine. And then Candice Fox, her gripping and exhilarating plot-driven thriller Fire with Fire, which is a propulsive tale that pits parental vigilante justice up against the incompetence and corruption of the LAPD, or at least parts of it. Her protagonist, the desperately wannabe police officer Lynette Lamb, who turns out to be a better, stronger and more ethical than those who tried to keep her out of the force. And lastly, Julie Janson's sweeping rural noir told from an Indigenous perspective from the land that was stolen from them. Her protagonist, Aunty June, who earned a TAFE certificate in Investigative Services and who takes on the local cops as the book winds through water rights and theft, environmental degradation, racism and past and current injustices. So as you can see, 4 very, very different books. It's sort of hard to know where to begin with such different books, except that there is one theme in common. They are all crime books. But they're also, as much as I can tell, at least with 3 of them, you're writing from your own sort of personal experience or perspective. Benjamin, in your case, you worked for, in publishing, for publishers. Can you tell us what that, what you bring to that book, how you got to that point to be able to write about the entrails of the industry?
Yeah, so the conceit of my book, Everyone on This Train is a Suspect, is that 6 crime writers go on the GAN, the famous train between Adelaide and Darwin, to do a crime writing festival and talk about writing crime books. But when one of them is murdered, the remaining 5 writers figure that they've all spent their lives writing novels about murders, so maybe they could try and solve it. So 5 writers become 5 detectives. But the problem is, if they can all solve a crime, they can certainly all plot out and commit one. So how do you find a killer in sort of that perfect environment where every suspect knows how to get away with it? So this is the setting of the novel. Like, it's a writers' festival. We were all backstage in the green room. Those are all scenes from the novel, and I just sort of brought them onto the page. And the thing with Locked Room Mysteries is that you lock a group of people together, 6 to 10 of them, and you set tensions and you see who kills each other. That's kind of how you write it. And I just thought, if I elevated all of our writers' egos and insecurities and anxieties, I say our writers generally, the writers in Australia are the most lovely bunch that you'll ever meet, but if I elevated all of those egos, what could be a motive for murder? So a publishing contract, a bad Goodreads review, a blurb on the cover, so they're all going through these kind of jealousies, and it leads to a murder that Ernest on the train has to solve. So I brought all that into the book to kind of make it feel like lived in publishing. I feel like publishing's never realistic in like films and stuff. There's people who have sort of full-time jobs and Upper West Side apartments, and all they do is read 1 book a month, and then they're just like, oh yes, publishing, champagne lunches. And so I wanted to kind of bring it down and have the writers be real people and interact with each other, but then elevate it. And that's why it's a murder mystery.
And some interesting observations on their relationships with their agents, with their publishers.
Oh yeah, so there's an agent in the book.
A lot of insider information, enough to turn anybody wannabe writers off.
Yeah, there's an agent in a book who's an absolute piece of work, and I sent it. Your agent is the first person to read the book. I sent it to my agent, and I said, just so you know, this isn't you. There's a publisher in the book who's an absolute piece of work, and the publisher is the second person to read the book, and I sent it to my publisher, and I said, just so you know, this isn't you. So there's a lot of defending that it isn't anybody real. But yeah, it's all drawn from sort of experience. I think that there's a few catty things that the writers in the book say to each other. So backstage, instead of "I loved your book," in the book they'll say to one another, "My mum reads your books," which is kind of like an insult. Like, she loves them, I wouldn't. And stuff like that I've overheard, or, you know, I'm a victim to my own ego. I've probably said some of it myself. So everything catty in the book is real, and I've just, upgraded it.
And Anne, you've worked a long time in the clinical side of psychiatry or psychology, and a lot of that clearly comes out in this book, because there's a lot of information that you need to have to write what you've written. How important was it for you in approaching that book, having that history?
Certainly means you don't have to do much research. I mean, the research is the last 30 years of work. But before I just mentioned, that is anyone giving a 1-star review to any of our books. Murder. But yes, so, and to me it also, because I mostly do perinatal psychiatry, the idea of that locked ward mystery, but in a locked room, but put it in a psych ward. And this is not your average psych ward. It's a mother and baby unit in a private setting, where you've got the mums coming for sleep settling, as well as those with more significant issues. So they can actually card themselves out, but the card is all registered, and so we know who's swiped in and out and stuff. So it just brought a whole lot of extra things that you could do to kind of get the reader puzzling about, oh, they were there and they were there. Now, who could have done that? Kind of, which, being an Agatha Christie fan from way back, I mean, I haven't read her for many years, but there's always, everyone wants to do a locked ward mystery, or locked room mystery.
I mean, we're all writing fiction, right? But getting the details right is really important. There's nothing worse than, I mean, I know if I read a book and I see a newsroom scene or something and it just doesn't ring true, immediately you just don't believe the book. You don't believe what's going on. So it's just really important, isn't it, to get those details right. Yeah,
and it's been a while since I had kids, but it was amazing how quickly I could get back into it. And this is the first one of this series I wrote in first person, and I really felt I was back there with a 12-month-older. And I do deal with a lot of 12-month, because I have a mother-baby unit in Melbourne, or parent-infant unit as we call it. So there are a lot of babies that you get to play with. I noticed you were playing with.
Oh, it's straight. There's a baby over there.
Oh, and for that, no babies were harmed in the making of this book.
I will walk off with people's babies, but I know that woman over there, so I didn't even ask. I just said, "Give me that thing."
I'm going to come to Candice last, because
save the best for last.
Save the best for last. But Julie, your book really is quite unique in that it is rural noir written from an Aboriginal perspective, which I have to say, one of the criticisms often of Australian rural noir at the moment is they don't really often engage with the past in that way. They don't engage with the Indigenous inhabitants. Often those towns are seen as, fairly white sort of towns. You've made something of a real difference to the genre by doing what you've done. Just tell us why. Why did you decide to write crime?
It wasn't I watch a lot of crime. I watch Vera, I'm a bit addicted to it, really. When I want my mind to relax, I watch some bloody murder. I don't know what it says about my subconscious. It's not pretty, and I'm ashamed of it, but it's just the way it is. But I actually wrote this novel originally as a kind of a social history novel. I was very concerned about the dying of the Darling River. And my father was in the Communist Party, and so was my mother, so I grew up with politics all the time, and I'm still involved in politics all the time. I just can't get away from it. I always think that an artist without politics is a warrior without a spear. You really need to grab that. So I'd written this kind of social history novel, and it really wasn't working, and I had a really good editor who came to the same decision at the same time as me, as it'd make a really good crime novel. And I thought, I've only written historical novels in the past. I wrote Benevolence, and I thought, how do I do that? So I got some books out on how to write a novel, right? And they say things like, start with a body. And I thought, okay, all right, I have to kill somebody. And I had this family that I really liked in this novel living along the Darling River. And I thought, well, I can just pick up, a cousin or somebody that no one knows much about, and we'll start with a body. And it had various other rules. And one of the other rules was nothing supernatural. And I thought, no, hold on. I'm an Aboriginal woman. I can't write anything that doesn't have a level of the supernatural. So I had to kind of transform the genre for my own ends. And so there's a lot of the supernatural as well, because the supernatural for most Aboriginal people is a living reality every day. And it's not the supernatural, it's grandma, or it's the dead that rise out on the Arnhem Highway at midnight in the moonlight to stop the car and ask you for a cigarette. Someone covered in blood on the Arnhem Highway out there in the Northern Territory stopped my car to ask for help, and then he was gone. So those kind of experiences then allowed me to imbibe that into the creation of this crime novel. I don't know how successful it was.
No, it's really successful, and it's very interesting. It's a different sort of pace, right? It's not, because there is a lot of dreaming in there. There's a lot of that sort of stuff. You know, there's a lot of mysticism, and it's a very different take on, and just as an example, and I won't get everybody to read bits from their book, but I just would like Julie to read this paragraph of a book, which sort of gives you an idea of the different perspective that she brings to it.
Chapter 12. The will... Better wear my glasses.
I thought for a second, we've all got chapter 12s, because you paused. Chapter 12.
No, this one's
Yep, that's the
6th of
perspective.
March. Yeah, right. The Wilga Railway Hotel was an old pub with wide verandas, wrought iron balconies and pillars of wood across the front. The local white fellas strolled around town and went to the supermarket and the stock and station agents and the RSL club next to the War Memorial. It had a metal cast soldier with a rifle and a plaque with decaying flowers on the granite base. There was no memorial for the thousands of dead Aboriginal people in the Black Wars. No recognition that Major Nunn had murdered hundreds of Aboriginal people and left them in burnt piles for crows to eat. No Waterloo Creek plaque, no Massacre Falls plinth or Gin's Leap statue, just smiling, bronze, white men on horseback, ammunition strung across chests.
I mean, how many small towns have got memorials to fallen white men? And there's not too many places that have. Well, I can't think of any really who have memorials to Indigenous injustice and Indigenous massacres. So you're writing a lot from your knowledge, your perspective. Yep. Candice, your book, set in LA around a heist of a DNA lab by a vigilante mother.
Yes, it's very relatable.
Yeah. I mean,
Where did
are
that
you
come
writing
from?
you're writing from experience?
No, well, a little bit. You know, my daughter Violet is 4. So, and I have the one child, and so I have never applied the wealth of crime knowledge that I have to my own child before. You know, when she was born, I just went, holy shit. Like, all of those possibilities that I imagined and all those true crime cases and all the things that have happened to sons and daughters out there, I never had a son or a daughter, so I didn't really apply it. So now I was thinking to myself, what would happen? What would happen if someone abducted my child? Or what would happen if someone murdered my child? Or what would happen if... And the answer always just came up that there would be extreme levels of violence. Like, I would just go full John Wick from day one. Like, you know, everything I know about how police can bumble a case, or, you know, detectives can get things wrong, or the things that happen in forensics labs, you know. I was fascinated by the idea that the forensic lab is this temple of truth, and everything that comes out of there is pristine and amazing, and DNA doesn't lie. You know, it's like, you know who works in forensics labs? People, like human beings. Human beings are lazy, and they make mistakes, and they stuff things up, and they get corrupted, and yeah. So having a child was terrifying for me in a host of other ways, just because I know so much about crime. And then, yeah, Lynette, one of the main protagonists in this novel, is fired on her first day of the job as a cop. And being a police officer for Lynette is all of her dreams come true, childhood dreams come true. This is what she's been waiting for. Her whole soul is about being a police officer. And on day one, the first time you meet her, she's being fired. And that's I think that came from me joining the Navy. I joined the Navy when I was 18 for some obscure reason, and I just thought, this is my home. I'm going to my home. I'm going to where I belong. I'm going to slap on a uniform and I'll fit right in and I'll finally be a part of something. I'll be a part of this big, beautiful family. And then I got there and I went, oh my God, I don't belong here at all. And the crushing, the soul, opening a door on what you think is your family and finding the room empty of people who understand you was sort of soul destroying. So I did that to that character. I played it out in that character. And, in my life now, I've found my family and I found where I belong. And then by the end of that novel, Lynette finds her family and she finds where she belongs. But that's how I related to that book.
There's also, there's a lot of research in there as well, just in the way the LAPD operates and, the SWAT teams and all that stuff. So there's just great detail.
Oh, thank you.
You obviously talk to a lot of people about how it all works, right?
Yeah.
And that's a great part of doing this, is getting to talk to those people.
Oh, thanks. Cops are great to talk to. You just have to get them over that.
Yes, exactly. You have to pretend you're not a journalist. You just, you're
Yeah,
just writing a book,
you
right?
just have to say to them, it's fiction, it's happening, deal with it, because the first thing they'll say to you is, oh, that would never happen. And you go, okay, but if it did, get on the fiction train, it's leaving the station,
And Ben, there's so much in your book about, what's the right way to put it? It's sort of conventions, I guess, about crime writing. Like how many times someone's mentioned is the determinant of who is the prime suspect and who you should... are there these conventions? I've never heard of them before.
Yeah, so basically when I set out to write these books, Everyone in My Family's Killed Someone is the one before this one and this one. I wanted to write a modern golden age mystery. The golden age mysteries are the ones from the 1930s, Agatha Christie et al. And the thing about the classics is that they all used to meet up and have lunch together. They called themselves the Detection Club, and they had this little vow that said that you can't use mumbo-jumbo, higgery, pokery, or feminine intuition to solve a crime, was their little vow. So clearly outdated, but they would have lunch and they had these rules about how they would write classic mysteries. And I found a set of 10 rules written by Ronald Knox, who was part of this Detection Club. And those rules include nothing supernatural. That's part of his sort of set of rules. The detective themselves must not commit the crime. Watson has to tell you everything. Watson must be dumber than the reader. These are all these kind of 10 intuitive rules or conventions of writing classic crime. And I thought that most modern psychological thrillers were sort of breaking them, that they didn't really exist anymore because they had become outdated. So I set myself the challenge to write a modern murder mystery that followed all of the classical rules. And to do that, the narrator, Ernest, knows all the rules. So he's aware that he loves mysteries. And when he finds himself in one, he sort of is able to say, well, I know how these work, so I'm going to deconstruct it. So it's sort of using the conventions as a playful way to subvert the expectations of the audience in what you expect is going to happen. And Ernest can sort of say to the audience, well, normally in a crime book, this would happen. I know you're expecting it. Or obviously my phone has run out of battery. And just playing with the genre that way.
Yeah, and it's very successful. It's great to see how the sausage is made. Even if you don't even know.
Yeah, but it's also a magic trick.
Yeah,
it's
course.
sort of like I'm showing you what I'm doing. Look over here, but I'm really doing it down here. So it's a method of crime, and it's a method of suspense, and it's a tactic that I use, as well as showing you how the sausage gets made.
Yeah. Anne, were you aware of that there was a sausage when you were writing your book?
Look, I've never done formal training and never looked at the list, but I read so much. It's kind of intuitive, I think, a lot of what I do. But it was interesting, probably the most non-formal, formal training I've done was my husband did a screenwriting course and said, you've got to read this book, which was Sid Field's screenplay, I think, something highly interesting title like that. But its screenplays are highly structured, and I found that incredibly, even though I have no desire to ever write a screenplay, it was incredibly helpful for understanding what I was doing intuitively. So I do have that in the back of my head now, which is a different sort of set of things to what you're talking about as the first act turning points, and certainly I've done master classes where they sort of talk about, you know, your subplots and how you twirl them through. So at some level you have to plan it. I am a planner more than a pantser. But that said, I rewrote the ending and changed who did it. So it's not that planned. But you need a degree of planning because you've got to plant the clues in, and you've got to, you know, allow the reader a chance to get the answer.
But it's a similar in a sense. It's like, you know, it is another sort of, I mean, none of these are technically locked room mysteries, which apparently have a whole lot of conventions all of their own.
Yeah.
But you know,
it's sort of a hat to it.
Yeah. You're contained in the instance of that book. You're contained in the ward, right?
Yeah, and sort of a hat to all of those, you know, fabulous previous, the golden age ones, but some more modern takes. Adrian McKinty did one that I thought was really good in one of his Irish books. And yeah,
he's very big on the conventions of the locked room, right?
Yeah,
you've got to, you know, he's actually very critical of people who don't follow the conventions of the locked room. And Julie, were you ever thinking about conventions when you were writing your book?
Look, I had a recent review of my book which described it as a very, very messy novel. I wasn't hurt by that. I've had much worse reviews for my plays. So I thought about that, but it was actually quite a positive review. And I don't get many reviews for books, so I was kind of thrilled just to have anything really. And it said maybe we need more of these kind of messy stories. And I thought the fact that I'd tried to marry the idea of the death of a river as the great metaphor for my novel, and the death of some young people in the novel were also metaphorical for the death of the river as well. But the political implications of what happens to a river system and the environment was really what kind of drove me to write the book. So I guess I do throw a lot of the conventions out of the window, but I do find it's very useful to read some of the great crime writers in Australia, especially for me, the women crime writers. I tend to not read many men crime writers. I'm going to have to make a difference here for Michael, because apparently we were at art school together, which we vaguely remember each other.
We sort of vaguely remember each other.
I said
it was a long time ago.
He was the very quiet one in the corner who was very polite, if I remember rightly. I'd like to respect conventions, and it makes it easier in some ways. If you've got some sets of rules, even a lot of them you throw out, I'd like to know if I'm doing something wrong, I'm doing it kind of on purpose. But maybe the next crimes that Aunty June solves, I'll follow more of the genre, I think.
Well, there is another Aunty June novel coming,
there is
isn't there?
at least one more anyway. I'm not sure if Aunty June will retire then and take up knitting or something, I'm not sure. But she's going to go and take on the frackers of the Northern Territory. So,
and Candice, yours is it's a sort of almost classical plot-driven thriller, right? It's, you know...
I have a feeling you really enjoyed this.
I did.
You're so praising of it.
It's a gripping, like, drives you through, like you're constantly being driven by this character and the events that happen. But
thank you.
Were you working with conventions in mind when you did it? I mean...
Yeah. Actually, reading Ben's novel and the rules made me curious about the rules. So I went and did a bit of a deep dive of all the crime writers who have written these lists of rules, and there's quite a few of them. Elmore Leonard wrote one, and his first rule, number 1, was never start with the weather. And I think that's a very succinct way of saying something that I deeply believe in, which is don't start your novel soft. Like page 1 needs to be a person with a problem. And it doesn't have to be the problem of the novel, you know, but so many manuscripts come in front of me sometimes, you know, because people say, will you look at my work? And I go, yeah, I'll look at the first, you know, little bit. And it's somebody waking up in the morning and going downstairs and talking to their wife, or these soft openings. You tell me about the town, or you tell me, you know, and that kind of thing. And I think there's no problem. Where's the problem? Get to the people, get to the drama. And we're living in a time when you really have, you know, 1 or 2 paragraphs to impress not only agents and publishers, but also readers, because they've got their phone and they're scrolling through books and they say, oh, well, maybe I'll read some Jane Harper. I've never read any Jane Harper before. I'll pick up the free excerpt, you know, and have a read and see if it suits me before I buy. And they're going to give you 1 or 2 paragraphs before they buy or they swipe away to the rest of the entire world's novels. They're all there on their phone. So, yeah, you can't start with the weather. Don't do that.
And you know, and how much is driven by, really by streaming as well, and what people's expectations are of this sort of genre drama in particular, right?
Yeah. My husband and I sit there all the time and we're flicking through Netflix and we always say, I give it 10 minutes. And that, after 10 minutes, it's like, I don't need to sit here. This is not the only thing that's on. Yeah. If I swipe away, I have access to the entire world's worth of TV. And I think that that's going to affect writing more so as we go on in time. People's attention spans are meeting this over-flooded market. I think that all writing is going to get more tight and tense.
I mean, Elmore Leonard's a sort of good example, but you know, towards the end, Elmore Leonard ended up basically writing plays, right? You know, because his whole thing was dialogue, right? And he basically got rid of almost every descriptive paragraph because he says, well, people skip over those anyway, you know, so just get to the dialogue. In the end, some of his later books were just like plays. You can go a bit far, I reckon.
You can go a bit far. I just got back they call it the style sheet on an edit of a novel, and I realised that the only thing that I'd said about one of the main guys, the only thing that the editor could discern about him was that he had dark hair. Dark hair. So, you know, in my early career as a writer, especially I was trying to become published, you're there and you're like, his hair had a certain wave to it, not quite a wave, but a kink, and then his eyes were meridian sapphire blue, flecked with gold, and like the visual description gets so deep, and like you say, people skip over that, and they go, you know, I've had people say to me about Fire with Fire, people go, oh, blah, 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 because Lynette is Korean. I go, she's Korean? You know, and they go, yeah, I saw her as Korean. And I go, well, all right,
she lives
whatever.
in Koreatown, doesn't she? Or
no.
You know, she went to
she lives in Koreatown. Yeah. Which is just a, you know.
Just an area.
Whatever it is, if you want to enjoy that character if you want to enjoy that character in that way, and that's how you saw her, that's fine. I don't care. But, there's sometimes the specificity functions and it matters, and sometimes it doesn't, you know.
And, you know, the thing about, as well, I think this sort of, the rural noir explosion in Australia is really about place, right? So there's a lot of description, actually, in a lot of these books, and it sort of goes against what we're saying, because they've become very, very popular, and a lot of it is about the immersion in place. And Julie, your book, where we're talking about the irrigation area, the Murray-Darling Basin and the Darling River. I mean, what does research look like for you? How much of that is just sort of knowledge, and how much is research?
I believe in going to the place. If it's in Australia, it might be a bit harder if you're writing about New York or something. But I just get out in the car with my husband, and nearly every year we drive along the Darling. I lived in Bourke for a year, which was a great privilege when I was quite young. I used to spend most of my time down at the reserve, and as I was walking down to the reserve with my 3-wheeled pram and my illegitimate child, as it was known in the days, blokes would drive past and throw rocks at me because I was heading for the reserve. Anyway, so I got an idea of what kind of town old Bourke was. But so that was, and I met some extraordinary Aboriginal people there, Nyempa people and Gamilaroi people living down on the riverbank, and who've become lifelong friends, and who I learnt so much from, and are still friends that I learn from every day, elders, Aunty Jenny Ebsworth being one of them. But going to the place to me was really important. And during that time in 2021, I think it was, when the river really dried up, I'll just tell this one anecdote. I drove with my husband Michael. I don't really drive, he does all the driving. I just talk, which he doesn't seem to mind for some peculiar reason. And we drove into Menindee. And no, not Menindee, into Wilcannia. We were in Menindee as well. The car broke down in Menindee. I won't go into that. And then we got to Wilcannia and went down to the river, and there was no river. There was a big, dirty pool of green water with some dead kangaroos around it. And we both stood there and looked at that, and all these dead, beautiful, ancient coolabah trees all around it. And we went, heavens, you know, you can read about it when you're sitting at home or watch it on telly. When you're actually standing there, and so we went up into town. It was a warm day and not terribly hot, but went into the little shop. Only one shop, and I wanted to buy some water because we'd run out. And I bought a bottle of water. It was black and yellow brand, 2-litre bottle, $6.95. And I went, how does a pensioner living in this town, and the town is 95% Aboriginal people, mostly Nyempa and Barkindji people, how does that old lady or old man, how do they drink anything if it's $6.95 for a 2-litre bottle, and every human needs, 6 litres a day or something? How does a young girl I saw buying chips for breakfast at the garage, how does she wash her newborn baby when there is no water but bright yellow bore water coming out of the tap? And I stood in that town and I felt this rage build up inside me. And I thought, this is greed, because we'd just driven through towns where the big cotton farmers had those great big machines. I don't know if you've seen, they're like a whole lot of praying mantises all together. And they go along the side of the river and they're going chunka, 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 chunka. And they're pumping out the very last of the groundwater from the river as the river is completely dry. And I just think, am I in some kind of lunatic land that this is okay? And anyway, at that stage I thought, I'm going to have to write a novel about the river. But for me, to write the novel about the river, I'm never going to be able to write non-fiction. It's just not me. I only write fiction. And I thought I'd use a family that I'd already written about in my play Gungies, and I would bring them to this river town, and we would see what would happen. So that was the beginning of it. But yeah, going to a place for me is very important. And the most recent novel I've researched is a historical novel about Newcastle and the Hawkesbury River. So I spent a lot of time driving up around Wollombi and up through the old bush tracks and down the old mountain roads and talking to Aboriginal people that we know in Newcastle. Going to a place that's really important.
And Ben, presumably you did the trip on the gun.
Yes, yeah. So we went on it to research the book. I like to sort of plot first and then find the research that fits the ideas that I'm trying to do. But yeah, we decided to go on the train as a tax-deductible holiday to research the book. And it was really handy because the minute we set foot on it, I realised that my finale wasn't going to work because the corridors were too narrow for this sort of running through the train thing I had planned. So I changed that. But also, writing a locked room mystery, and in our section of the GAN, there were no locks on any of the doors. So I was like, this is a murder mystery. People have to go into rooms and lock doors and hide from people, and there's no locks on any of the doors. So I started asking around the train. I was like, well, you know, which doors do have locks? Is there a lock, for example, on the driver's carriage? And then the staff member was like, that is a strange question to get from this customer. I'm like, no, just hypothetically, if you wanted to get in, like, could you drive the train? And then they were very nice, and they said, well, yeah, exactly. And then they were very nice, and they said, no, but there is the one lock in this section is there's a public toilet, and there's the meat freezer in the walk-in meat freezer in the kitchen.
That's
and I
convenient.
said, could you put a body in it? And then I told them I was writing a novel. But that was really helpful because they said, no, we wouldn't put a body in it. We would put a body here. And then they showed me where they would put a body. So that's in the book. I just think it's really useful. Yeah, you know, you connect with it and you sort of learn things that maybe you didn't know or that maybe you don't anticipate it. I'm pretty light with research. If it doesn't suit the story, I'll toss it out. I want it to be realistic but not a slave to it. Yeah. So one of the things that I like to do is that my detectives, you know, Candice puts a lot more effort in than I do. My detectives are never trained, never law enforcement, never, you know, firemen or anything where they have to know things. So my characters pick up a gun and shoot a gun, or most of the time they don't even know how to shoot the gun they're holding because I don't want to look up if it's a Glock 42 60 metres per second velocity bullet. I'm not Tom Clancy. So.
You can make some big mistakes trying to do that too.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and here's the thing about writing a book about trains is that people who like trains, they really like trains. Yeah. Like, And they
And
know
they'll tell you all
everything
about it.
about it. So I'm writing about the tonnage and the haulage and the engine class, and I'm like, I'm going to get this wrong, and I am going to get emails about it. So I think you sort of set yourself up. I mean, it's impossible to do it fully correctly in anything that you're researching. But, you know, I just try and get the spirit of it, and if that comes across, then I'm pretty fine with it. But connecting with what you're writing about is so important.
And in your book, it's not so much the place, I guess, which of course you would know intimately, and Melbourne, which you obviously know, but it's the people and the characters. I mean, there's asylum seekers. There's, you know, I mean, how much of that was?
I mean, none of them are
researched?
my patients, but obviously I've had patients like all of them, and there's a lot of commonality of themes and things in someone with certain diagnoses or situations with refugees. And I do quite a bit of medico-legal work, so I did get involved with a couple of actual refugees and their babies who died. So so that's all kind of there, but then I reimagine it to fit the plot, and there's usually a bit of, you know, several characters all piled into the actual people. And I guess my books, I'm really keen to, it's about the why did it as much as the who did it. This is about understanding people and why things might happen. But with when these two are talking, the book before this, which is a standalone one, The Long Shadow, is set in, I've renamed it, but Nyngan in northern New South Wales. And I certainly had to go there. And I picked Nyngan particularly because I had to have something geographically that was desert and could flood. So went and spent a bit of time there, and then I redesigned the town a bit to suit myself, just to kind of, so it's not exactly Nyngan. But also interestingly, there was a clear Indigenous kind of in the town. There was a component of locals who were Indigenous, and as a white writer, I'm very anxious about that, putting in an Indigenous character, but I thought, no, I need to have an Indigenous character if it's set in this town. And in the end, she's my favourite character. I just fell in love with her and had an Indigenous reader read it for me, and she suggested ways of making it better, which was fantastic. But she's the character that really became alive, and it's, I guess, because I wanted. She had to be right, coming from where I was. She's not the main character, but she's the second main character. by shots, yeah.
And Candace's book basically centres around this DNA lab, police DNA lab, which is hijacked by this vigilante mother.
Yes.
But there's some fantastic detail in there, like one-shots. Tell
Oh,
us
yeah.
about one-shots.
Well, actually,
And where, like, did you? I mean, is that something you discovered while you were doing it?
no, I just I'm in the very privileged position of being able to do a shout out on the internet sometimes and say, does anybody know about this? And you would not believe what is in my fan base. You know, that I found, this is a bit of a side tour. I was having my deck rebuilt and I found some bones under my deck, and I thought, how perfect is this? Wouldn't it be great if it was a body? And I took some photos of the bones and I put them on my Facebook, and I said, does anyone know what kind of bones these are? And a quadruped spinal specialist was in my fan base, and he was like, Candace, love your books. So you can tell that is a sheep or a goat because of the way that the wings on the end of the vertebrae do this and that. And I was like, holy shit, who else is out there? But I did a shout out, and I was like, hey, writing a book in LA, are there any, detectives or cops or LAPD out there? And a guy wrote back to me and he said, I'm not based in LA, I'm based in Santa Barbara, but, let's chat. And I just bought him a few beers and then off we went. So I lived in LA for a year, and that's why I keep writing about it, because I love that city. But also I went out there specifically when I was writing Fire with Fire, and I looked at different locations. And so I had him take me to Hertzberg Davis and say, all right, well, where would they put this and where would they put that, and how would, which rooms are we talking about here? And he was able to tell me about, and undercovers, because there's an undercover kind of element. Charlie Hoskins is one of the other protagonists in the novel. and he's been undercover for 5 years. And so that detective was able to tell me about some undercovers that he worked on. So it was wonderful. It was, the research leads you into all sorts of different things, and sometimes your interests, what you want to research, dictates the story. So I fell in love with New York as well, and I wanted to write about firefighters in New York, and so I based a story around them. And then I told all my friends, I said, well, I'm off to New York now, tax deductible trip, and I'm going to go and chase down some firefighters. And so I did, and I just wanted to write something about them. And then I did that, and that was an amazing amount of research and wonderful stories. I couldn't possibly use everything that I found out about New York firefighters in that novel, but that's what's coming next.
But the DNA place has there's one-shots.
Oh, sorry, I went right off there.
Can I just return? I just wanted to say, this cop, not a great undercover cop. If you put the call out, hey, any undercover cops? And he's written to you and said, yes, I am.
me.
You got me, Candice.
Hi, here I am. He just had a little fake mustache on. The one-shots. Okay, what is a one-shot? A one-shot is it's a term that they use for a piece of DNA, a forensic sample, which in the testing of it, you will have to destroy it. So sometimes that's the follicle on a hair. They're coming up with ways now that you can test a hair follicle for DNA without actually destroying it. But in the past, that's your one shot. So if you have one hair follicle, that's and so that's what they're holding to ransom, really. These parents, they're saying, we will destroy, and they happen to know which samples in the lab are one shots and which ones are not, and they're only destroying those. And so that's a bit of a clue for the police on the outside who are dealing with this. They're saying, well, who told them that? And it's such a tense situation, if I do say so myself. It's such a tense situation for everyone, because it's like, they're dealing with the shock of how did this happen, but also what are we going to do, so I'm proud of that novel.
Very tense.
Fun research. Yeah.
The time has come. We'll open up with some questions. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. No? Surely someone's got a question. What about on Zoom? Here we go. Here's one. Is this a general question? I guess it's a pretty good general question.
Gonna say,
so the question is, have you ever been caught out by readers? And I think everybody's been caught out
We were
occasionally.
talking about guns and things before, though. I have done a lot of writing of and she flicked the safety switch and all that, just doing my best at it. I have never had a letter from a reader about something like that. What I have had a huge amount of letters about, and quite passionate and angry letters, is plants. Plants. The one particular novel, Redemption Point, I got poincianas and poinsettias mixed up. And I'm still getting letters about it, and every time, because the editor missed it as well. Yeah. It wasn't just me; it was her as well. And I flick them over and I say, "There's another one. There's another one."
And if you just replied, I'd stop writing them. But
Yeah. So I don't write about plants anymore. But I've had very specific ones. Somebody said to me, in this novel, it's state of origin season, and frangipanis are flowering, and those two things do not happen at the same time. And I'm like, okay, all right, I'm sorry, I'm going to change it.
It's fiction.
Yeah. I've been lucky enough to be published in Germany, and the Germans love a detail as well. And so I got an email from them about, there's a scene in Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone where someone's trapped in the back of a truck and they have to get out as it's rolling down a hill before it hits an ice-covered lake and then goes into the lake. And, it's all tilting and everything in the back of the truck is sort of rolling towards with gravity. And this German guy just emailed me and he said, "You've never studied physics, have you?" And I'm like, I have studied physics. It's a fiction book. Anyway, so, yeah, people love a correction.
Yeah. Well, I had one correction, which was I live in a very small town on the south coast of New South Wales, Maruya. And I've had a few kind of experiences with bikies, and a couple of bikies appear in my novel. And I observed them at very close quarters. I'd go for a swim down in the river where we've got a shack, and sometimes the local bikie group would be having a chapter meeting down there, which consisted of big hairy blokes in white Y-front underpants roasting some kind of animal on a spit at 9 o'clock in the morning with beers in their hands on lounges along the riverbank where you're trying to have your naked swim. You usually wore a costume in that case. Anyhow, one of these bikie guys saw me and he said, "I've read your book." And I said, "Oh," I said nervously. And he said, "Where did you do your research about the bikies?" And I'm like, "Oh, the internet, And then he said, "Well, all your armaments are wrong." And I went, "Oh, I'm really sorry. Could I call on you for some information next time?" He said, "Too right, I like your books. You can do that." So I thought...
Excellent. Anne, ever been caught out?
No one's game in the psychiatric kind of field. That's a little bit of a problem. But look, I'm sure I have written about bikies, but I just don't think bikies are going to be reading my books. So I think I'm pretty safe. And motorbikes, I'm sure I've got stuff wrong about motorbikes because she's a keen motorbike rider. But again, I don't know that motorbike riders big
the
on
trains.
my books.
Oh, you're just buying yourself a world of pain.
Yeah, you know what you're getting in for.
Anyone else?
I just, after what Candace said about too much detail and description, do the rest of the writers believe in that? In that I've always thought that sometimes a good book is about the detail, especially in crime books as well, because I thought the detail was essential. So I found it fascinating that someone thought one of your main characters was a Korean. Did you say a Korean?
Yeah, Korean, yeah. I've had a couple of readers say to me, I thought she was Korean. And I didn't set that out, but, I'm happy, for people to imagine things as they want. I'm trying to clarify what I say about setting and description and don't start with the weather and that kind of stuff. I think sometimes it's functional and sometimes it's not. And if it functions in the book and it makes things more beautiful or it makes things more grounded or it eases the plot along by intensifying what actually is in the plot, then I think, it's good. But that first paragraph, I think, is something where weather, whether in this example, weather does not function, it should not function. So obviously setting and grounding and place for your genre that you work in, rural noir is functional and important. But I think that a lot of times it's not. And knowing the difference will make you a good writer or not. But anyway.
And it's not so much, I wouldn't have thought it's detail. I mean, detail is important, but it's sort of descriptive writing. And sometimes there is great descriptive writing, clearly. I mean, and, it's very moving and whatever and gripping. But sometimes there's too much of it and it gets in the way of the story.
For me, it's anything that gets in the way. If you're whittling it down and it doesn't add to the movement of the scene, the wants and the goals of the characters, or the central mystery, in my case, then it has to go. And that includes description, detail, dialogue, characters, everything. You've just got to be willing to cut it out so that every scene is moving and doing what you want it to. And sometimes what you want it to is describing things and focusing on details, and they help you construct it and set the mood and the tone. But if it's in the way, it goes. That's how I feel.
But particularly in these books, if you want fast-paced action book, I think literary writing is completely different. But in crime, tends to need to push that
But
narrative
even literary
forward.
writing doesn't waste words. They're choosing those descriptions and those sentences that are beautiful and, let's say, flowery, for lack of a better word, in that style of literary writing. That sentence was probably twice as long in the first draft. They're cutting it as well. We're all cutting. Writing is cutting. That's the whole thing.
But it's not going to be plot-driven in the same way as ours tend to be plot, or character-driven too, but plot is big.
So my question sort of follows from that, Benjamin. Is it, when are you doing that cutting? Is it the end of each day, the end of each chapter? I know a lot happens later. Do you go back and rewrite, or how does it...
Yeah, it depends on the type of writer that you are. So I start every day editing what I wrote the day before, and I don't move through a manuscript until I believe that it's at a point where I would be happy for people to see it. So I'm very sentence by sentence go down the manuscript, and then when I finish it, I actually don't do a second draft before my agents and publishers see it, because I've done like 6 or 7 drafts as I go. So when I type the end, I have finished the novel. A lot of writers, I don't know how all of you write, but will sort of vomit it out and then edit it later, and that's a very valid technique as well. So it just depends, but I'll just cut. Yeah, I tend to cut as I go. I cut yesterday's writing today.
I'm exactly the same. That's exactly how I work. And just in a linear fashion. Yeah, sorry. I'm exactly like that. In a linear fashion, and I start the day by looking at what I did yesterday, just to get back in the mood, but also to make that as good as it can be. Yeah.
But I sometimes think a really good editor that you trust is like gold. Like I just, lie down at the feet of good editors. The latest novel I wrote, which is not a crime novel yet, it's got an awful lot of crime in it, the particular editor, she said, look, this is like a fantastic, great big overstuffed couch, Julie. It's full of all sorts of amazing anecdotes and stories and characters, but it doesn't have the buttons on the couch that pull the story together. There's 3 buttons, and she said it was the protagonist's father, and the protagonist's daughter. And she said, and they will pull the story together. And it was just this simple comment. I did a complete rewrite based on what she'd said, because she absolutely nailed what was missing to pull that novel together. And so, sometimes it can be a really good editor saying one thing to you that can really change your novel from a mediocre, rambling, messy novel to something that actually works.
And all these books, crime books, I've written same way you do, but the one I've got coming out next year, which is set in a mental health facility without a crime, was a vomit draft. I think I wrote the whole thing in like 2 weeks. I was on fire. I worked 12-hour days, and it was just pouring out of me. It was the book I feel I was born to write in many ways. And then, of course, on the final edits, 29 complete passes. It's been painful, but the core is still there. And I had to put that authentic core down before we could rewrite it, because it is written with my husband. So, yeah, it's been a long process, but we've got there.
Just out of interest, how many people here are aspiring crime writers? Yeah, it's always fascinating, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
I will say,
it's great.
I'll back up. I'll back up your statement on the editors. That even though I say I get it pretty good at the first start, like I'm impeccably edited, and I'm very grateful for the editors.
Oh,
So
yeah.
every step, there is so much work between that, whether you do a vomit draft or a what you think is a polished draft, that the editing is crucial and significant on every single book.
My Fire with Fire, actually, I sent a pre-apology to my editor, and I said, I'm so sorry for what you're going to have to deal with in this, because of the timelines, and you've got 3 different parties, and they're all doing things at the same time in separate areas of LA. And I knew that she's the kind of editor who was going to sit there and go, well, it takes 20 minutes to drive from here to here, and in this time, this guy has to do this, and then not this. And I was like, sorry.
Try writing a book where on page 1 you say there's going to be a murder on page 120 and give that to your editor.
Yeah.
Right. Anyone else? Yes.
Without wanting to sound too creepy, if I was to sneak into your bedrooms, what would I find on your bedside table in terms of reading material?
Oh, wow. Okay.
I mean, recently it's been easy, because when you come in a panel, I've got these guys all piled up, so that made it really easy. But I've just finished, in the midst of reading these guys, a couple of literary novels, or literary non-fiction and novels, Mothers by Jacqueline Rose, which was a bit daunting, really. I've recently become a grandmother, and it's just kind of really interesting to look at. It's an amazing book which really looks at everything from the Greek mythology about motherhood to the psychoanalytic kind of view. So I've just finished that one. But generally I read a lot of crime.
One of the nice things about... Oh, sorry, you go.
You, darling.
Oh, one of the nice things about being a writer is that people send you books before they come out. So you would find the new Tana French, which comes out next April, on my Kindle. And it's very, very good.
And I've been reading David Marr's Killing for Country, but I have to keep putting it down because it is so painful. And when I came to the episode which talked about Alloa country, which is the country that I lived in for a year teaching at the Minieri School, 390 kilometres south-east of Catherine Town in the Northern Territory, and realised that the team that his great-great-grandfather was on also killed people right there in that country in the Northern Territory. And I was so flabbergasted, because that's one of the communities that's been marked for fracking. And I already knew about the massacres that happened there, but I didn't realise they'd happened in the late 1800s as well. So David Marr's book's been a revelation, but not the kind of revelation that Australia is maybe ready for, because it's real truth-telling about the crimes of this country.
Well, there was a question there. What was it called?
Killing for Country.
Well, on my reading list at the moment is completely off topic because my daughter, like I said, she's 4. She's asking me a lot of questions about dinosaurs that I cannot answer, and I don't know. And so I'm reading Bill Bryson's Complete History of Almost Everything. Yeah, and it just tells you about the galaxy and the planet and the discovery of dinosaurs. And yeah, I was telling her about, you know the saying, she sells seashells by the seashore. Yeah, there was Mary Anning was a little girl who found a bone on a seashore, and she would sell them, and she grew up to become a scientist. And I was telling this story to Violet. And I said she grew up and she found the very best sample of a pteranodor that ever, was found. And Violet said to me, "Mum, can you write a storybook about that?" And I said, "All right, okay, But there actually is one, so I just ordered it. There's already a Mary Anning book, kids book, and I said I'll get it for you from Booktopia.
Careful, this pteranodor bone is a one-shot, so don't mess it up.
You'll find out who killed the pteranodon or whatever it is.
There's a question here. Sorry.
Well, I've just been reading Chris Womersley, The Diplomat, which is a terrific book, and also Claire Keegan. I know I'm late to the Claire Keegan party, but just the idea of small novels. She writes 25,000-word books or something, and they're just a brilliant little snapshot of Irish society. It's been very, very rewarding to read. There's another question from the back. The baby has a question.
Can I be cuddled by Candace again?
It's on. Okay.
How important do you think it is to you for your upcoming novels and also to aspiring writers to write a main character who is not your usual detective? Because in the last few years there's been quite a few books that have come out with unusual main characters or main characters with differences, I guess. I'm thinking like Veronica Lando's The Whispering, her main character is an amputee, and Danuka Mackenzie's The Torrent was a pregnant main character. So how important do you think it is in publishing to include something with a difference like that?
Throw it open.
I think it's not important on an architectural level to differentiate a character by something like that. But I think that the way to write a successful novel is to write the story that only you feel you can write. That if you didn't write it, it wouldn't be on the shelf. And I think that if you write those kind of stories, then your detective won't be like anyone else on the shelf.
I have really wanted to be an author since I was about 12. I was taking it pretty seriously, at 12. And so I've been listening to what agents and publishers say and people who work in publishing, what they say, for all of that time and paying careful attention. And all of that time I hear this question, it comes up a lot. They'll say to you, how is it different? And in a sense, I think they do want it to be different and for you to say, my detective is like no other because they are, a pregnant lady or an amputee or this or that or whatever. But they also want it to be the same in a certain way. And so you can be different for the sake of being different and it won't hit. But like you say, if you're different and you do it in a genuine sort of way and in a meaningful way and in a functional way in that novel, then I think it's a good thing. I just think, you know, the rise of the internet and the rise of the podcast and the rise of the citizen, the armchair detective has opened up people's minds to the whole idea that crime solvers don't have to be hard-boiled detectives. They don't have to be men in their 50s who are on the outs with the cops and have an alcohol problem. It could very well be you or you or you. And that's why we're hearing all of these stories, all of these different, you know, ages and occupations and all that kind of thing.
And my Aunty June is a celebration of every mature woman I've ever worked with, every auntie, every, you know, mother, sisters, and Aboriginal women and non-Aboriginal women who are often just work every single day to look after their families and community and never get any kind of praise for it, and very rarely are celebrated in literature. And I kind of had a look at myself in the mirror one day and I said, Julie, you've got to make your main characters older, you know, and just actually celebrate that kind of joy. So Aunty June came from my desire to put an Aboriginal mature woman centre stage who still liked the occasional liaison with a young man if she could find one. So, that's Aunty June.
Yeah, Julie doesn't shy away from the sex in the book. I think that's sort of, that's us. Yeah, we're done. So look, thank you very much. It's been a terrific panel, and all very, very different, as you will have noticed. So please give a round of applause for our writers.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank